right, so we introduced a lot of new concepts in this section of the course. So as always, let's take a few moments to review everything that we learned. We began with conditional renders, and that is a special syntax that allows us to conditionally render a bit of JSX. That means that we can render that JSX only if some condition is true. The way the syntax works is within our JSX, we provide the curly braces, then a Boolean, then the double ampersand symbol, which is JavaScript's AND operator, and then the JSX that we want to conditionally render. And of course, that JSX will appear in our HTML, in our markup, but only if the Boolean evaluates to true. So it doesn't make sense for this Boolean to be a hard-coded true or false. Rather, what you're typically going to see is that Boolean is going to be subject to variance. So for example, that Boolean may come from a state property that is going to change over time. And of course, as it changes, that will determine whether or not that JSX will render on screen. So in our forum, a perfect example was we used the login mode state property to conditionally determine whether we would show the user the confirmed password field. We only wanted that to be present in the registration mode, so we connected it to that piece of state. Now, that is not the only application. Another way that we can utilize this strategy is having that Boolean be something like a prop that flows in from a parent. So maybe a parent will provide a prop that is either going to be true or false, and that will allow the component to render in two different ways, right? In that case, the prop may not change over time, but the look and layout of the component will. And the same rules apply. We can determine whether this small chunk of a component or this small chunk of JSX will appear based on a condition being met. And that is a pretty powerful feature that we can utilize. We also saw that we can use the exclamation point to invert a Boolean value, and that is not React specific, that is regular JavaScript syntax, but that can help us when our dynamic Boolean is not exactly what we want. So in our scenario, we didn't want login mode, we wanted the opposite or inverse of login mode, and we were able to get the form we wanted by combining that symbol with our login mode state property. The next thing we talked about is the special React fragment component. In order to demonstrate its purpose, we first discovered a problem, and that was that every React component must return one top-level element, one top-level parent. So if you need to return multiple elements, which means just adjacent elements or sibling elements at the same position, you can't return that from a component because you always just need one top-level parent. And sure, you could wrap those multiple elements in something like a div, but that will create additional markup and additional elements in the HTML that aren't really needed. So the solution that the React development team came up with is this special React fragment component. That fragment is available on the React object that you import from the React library, and you simply write that component as the top level parent, and then you can nest as many children as you want within it. And we saw that the alternate syntax for that, rather than explicitly writing React.fragment, was simply doing the opening and closing not curly, but bracket syntax to indicate the opening React fragment component. And then the complementary closing tag was the less than sign, the /, and the greater than sign. They're both the exact same thing. They're both a React fragment component, and I prefer the more verbose version, the actual explicit React.fragment, because it's easier to Google, but some other developers prefer the alternative syntax because it requires less code. But they're both the same thing, and they both solve the same problem, which is returning multiple elements from a component or from a block, such as when we're using the ampersand symbol for conditional rendering. We also saw how we could pass a function to the setState method. In all of our previous uses of this method, we passed in a regular object. If we pass in a function, that function will return a very similar object. The object will hold the properties that should be updated on the current state along with their next values. However, the functional approach is recommended for a particular scenario, and that is when you use your current state to derive your next state. So if your next state is just going to be generated or you know what it is, then you can just use an object. But if you want to use current state to derive or calculate next state, then it's a good idea to use the functional approach. And we saw an example when we transitioned our handle mode change method to use the current value of the login mode state property to get the next value for that property, which is always going to be the inverse Boolean. So once we went to that approach, we needed to know what the current value was in order to invert it and get the next value. And we saw how we could do that with passing a function. To that function, React will provide the current version of the state as the first parameter. And typically you're going to call that something like prev state because it's about to become the previous state with the changes that you're going to designate in the object that you return from that function. We also learned about the alternate state declaration syntax. So rather than declaring this.state in the constructor method, we can simply declare a top-level state class property directly in the body of our component class. And this is cleaner and obviously does not require things like super props. So a lot of developers prefer this approach. But keep in mind, this is not supported in regular vanilla JavaScript. So your codebase requires the correct Babel configuration to enable this syntax to work and be correctly transpiled by Babel into JavaScript that the browser can understand. So Create React App, of course, supports this syntax out of the box, but if you're working with an older React project that was not made with Create React App, it may not. So you have to be careful when using it because your codebase may not yet support it. Okay, we also learned about the onChange event. Again, an event is just simply something that happens. Typically, it's going to be a user interaction. And we can react to different events on different elements by writing event handlers. And the way we do that is using this on syntax, where we're going to have the on keyword followed by the event that we are responding to. So for a button, for example, we had on click. And for our inputs, both our text inputs and our password inputs, we similarly provided the onChange event. And as always, we pass that prop/attribute a function or method that React will invoke when that event occurs. So in this case, it's whenever the user types a character or deletes a character, every single time that happens, the onChange event will trigger and React will run that function or method. So to clarify, if the user types 5 characters, React is going to run that method 5 times, right? Not just once, but every single time the user types a character. And each time that happens, of course, React will generate that synthetic event object with a whole bunch of metadata related to the event, and we can access .target.value on that event to retrieve the input's latest entry. So each time React will generate a new event, and each time you're going to have the most up-to-date value that the user has entered into that input. That brings us, of course, to controlled elements, and a controlled element is one that React has full control over. So React is responsible for both reading and writing to the element. And the way we typically do that is, for example, with a text input, we can set what it displays on screen by using the value attribute in line. So in a controlled element, we connect value with a piece of our component state so that when the component state updates, we update the value that the user sees on screen. So that's how we kind of send that state down to the component. And then the way that we write state, of course, is with the onChange event handler. So the way the flow works is the user types a character, we trigger the onChange method to run, that updates the component state, that state flows down and forces a component re-render, and then that state makes its way to the value attribute, and that's when the user actually sees everything appear in the input. Of course, this process takes milliseconds, it's instantaneous, but it's important to note that the entry that the user just typed first goes into React component state and then actually affects the UI. So the key takeaway is that React always has the most up-to-date value of the user's entry. React has the state to store what the user has typed in. And the advantage of that is when the user submits the form, we have all the data that we need gathered in state. We don't have to manually reach into the UI and look for an input and look for what we currently have entered into it, because at that point, React will have all the data it needs. In our case, React had complete control, so React had the correct email and the password and the confirmed password entries whenever we submitted the form, and we were simply able to use those properties on a regular JavaScript object, that being this.state, and kind of immediately have that data gathered up front with no need to manually manipulate or query the user interface. All right, we also saw how we could provide additional arguments to event handler methods. So React expects a handler to be a function or a method with one parameter. And of course, React will provide its generated synthetic event object as that argument. So we run into a problem if we want to provide additional data into that function or method. So what we can do is live up to React's expectation by having our event handler just simply be a function with one parameter, but in the body of that function, we'll invoke another function or method that we have complete control of, and then in that secondary function or method, we can define whatever parameter list we want and accept whatever extra arguments we want. We can choose whether or not we even want to provide the event object or not, and any additional information that we may want to provide to that secondary function or method. All right, we also explored an alternate syntax for declaring our prop types and default props. Previously, we declared the component, and then afterwards we used the dot syntax to write dot prop types and dot default props. And this is still the syntax you're going to need to use if you're using functional components. But specifically, if you're working with a class component, you can declare prop types and default props within the class body, within the component body, but you have to make sure to prefix both of those terms with static. And that static will declare it as a component class property. So you write static space prop types, then that object of prop type declarations, and similarly static space default props, and then that object with the prop names as well as the default values to fall back on if the parent component does not provide those props. All right, finally, the last thing we talked about was form submission. So when the user clicks a button within a form container with a type of submit, React will trigger a form submission event. And the way we react to that is on the actual form element. We provide the onSubmit prop/attribute, and just like with anything else, we provide a function or method to run when that form is submitted. Now, by default, going back all the way to the original invention of the web browser, when a form is submitted, that triggers a redirect or refresh, typically to a web page specified by the backend. And that breaks the spirit of a single page React application, because the whole design here is it's one HTML page and one big JavaScript bundle, and JavaScript is going to continually rebuild and modify the UI. So we don't want to have a page refresh or redirect. So what we need to do is prevent that default form behavior. And the way we do that is we take that synthetic event object that we always will have, because React will always generate it and give it as the first argument to our handler method or function. And then when we call prevent default, we prevent that behavior. So that's typically going to be the number one line you see in that method. And then afterwards, we perform the actual form submission logic and find some way to communicate with our backend. In this case, obviously, our application didn't have any kind of backend, so we just did some basic front-end logic to verify that the user provided some email, some password, and we alerted them with a message. But that would be the place where you, for example, make a request to your backend with the user's credentials to authenticate them, or perhaps to register a new user account, etc. So that logic is done after you prevent the default behavior, which is the form submission triggering the page redirect/refresh. All right, so lots of cool concepts covered in this section. Hope you had fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.